if you could share with everybody how that sort of came to be.
Sure. Yeah, so in 2012, I gave this TEDx talk, and the advice in preparing for the TEDx talk from the coaches and the executive team there was, this is the talk of your life. This is the talk of your life. And I think they were just trying to scare us into preparing and taking the talk seriously. But, I think I, for whatever reason, my brain malfunctioned. I was like, oh, this is the talk of my life. Like, I'm literally like, is this an invitation for me to talk about my whole life? And so I did. And so as I was writing the talk, I thought, well, all right, this is the first time that this is probably the only time I'm going to have this big of a platform of like 300 captive people in an auditorium, and they can't escape. So I'm going to talk about all the things that I love, which are like John Hughes, 80s pop culture, the refugee experience, grammar, and Star Wars. Like, what could possibly go wrong? And in 12 minutes, right? So I like cooked up this crazy talk, and the response was really amazing. And so from that, I started doing live storytelling, sort of in the style of The Moth here in Portland, Maine, and beyond, where I would just have to like get up on stage and tell like a 7-minute true story. And then in 2016, and so that really, for me, like the storytelling piece primed the pump for this idea of like, oh, like maybe I do have a story to tell. I don't know. And then in 2016, a literary agent, saw the TED Talk and reached out to me and just asked if I was interested in writing memoir, and at that point, for 4 years, I'd been already sort of like crafting these stories about, true events from my life. And so I was like, sure, why not? Like, what could go wrong, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and the story of talking about your story and your family coming to America and all that. When I listened to your TED Talk, I did a rewatch just a couple days ago, and you talk about the subjunctive and all of that kind of stuff, which reminded me how little I talk about grammar in my real life.
Yeah, this is really why we're on the call, right? It's like, oh, tell me more.
But I thought what was really interesting that was in the TED Talk and that's also in the book is the story of your family coming here, and that day you were supposed to leave, and sort of fate intervening. And I think it's just sort of a powerful beginning to what becomes your whole entire story. So I thought if you could share with everyone sort of that story, that's sort of the impetus of both the talk and at the center of the book.
Sure, yeah. And so basically, my grandparents worked for the US Embassy in Saigon, and in 1975, actually this coming week, it's the whatever it is, I can't do the math now. It was 1975. This is 2021. Oh my God, there's so much math there. 47th year, 40. Anyway, it was the anniversary, 46th anniversary of the fall of Saigon this week. So my grandparents worked for the U.S. Embassy, and as the South Vietnamese government was collapsing, the American government decided that they would evacuate collaborators and contractors who worked for the U.S. government, of which my grandparents were two. And so they chose 12 people to evacuate, and I was one of them. My parents were also, in that group, and we were in line waiting for a bus to take us to the airfield where we would be evacuated. And it was like a long line, and these buses would pull up, and people would just like sort of throng onto the bus, and then the buses would take off, and then finally, like, it was our turn to get on the bus. And my whole family got on the bus, and then I started crying for some reason, like so loudly and inconsolably that my grandmother was just so annoyed. She was like, "All right, fine, like, let's get off the bus." Like, clearly Phuc is having none of this. So we got off the bus and just waited for the next bus, and then we let the other 12 people in line behind us get on in our place. And then as our bus, the one that we were supposed to be on, pulled away, like, just as it pulled away, it was struck by mortar fire and blew up, and everybody on the bus was killed. So yeah, and then we just waited for the next bus, and then it pulled up, and we got on, and that did not blow up, and then and we escaped.
Yeah, I mean, that story in itself is just an example of how fate intervenes at times, and you know, you can't ever explain it. But that story just has so much feel to it. Like my heart just tenses when I hear it. So I'm so glad that you were not on that bus and you were able to come here and share with us your story. I thought we would start, you know, the book has a lot of discussion regarding assimilation and coming to America. And one of the things that you talk about that really stuck out to me was the pronunciation of your name. It's in the beginning and sort of your name throughout your life. So if you could talk about the decision of your family for the English pronunciation of Phuc, and then also the day you were Peter. If we could talk a little bit about that.
Oh no. Oh gosh. Yeah.
So start with your dad, the conversation you had with your dad about your English name.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
then,
Yeah.
you know, then we'll transition into the day you were Peter.
Yeah, this is good. Let me just text my therapist here just to get him on speed dial so that I can recover. Yeah, no. So I mean, I think it's a very common I think it's a very common, you know, immigrant experience or refugee experience. Like if you don't have like an Anglo name, like either, you know, the name gets twisted or bent a little bit, you know, because of English, right? Or you just pick a totally different name. And I think it's what many refugees have to go through. Like unless you're from England, I guess, you know, then you just have to, God forbid, you have to spell Jeffrey G with a J or something like, you know, traumatizing like that. Yeah, it's really tough. You know, I feel for them, not to belittle any of the Jeffreys out there with G's. So yeah, so in Vietnamese, I mean, Vietnamese is tonal, right? So the language has like 5, depending on the dialect, it has like 5 or 6 tones, much like Chinese. So like that's a challenge anyway for, you know, non-Viet speakers. And it's subtle, right? So like the word for star in Vietnamese is sao, and then the number 6 is sao. And so if you don't speak tonally, like sao and sao sound very similar. So like your name's already getting butchered by non-Viet speakers. And so like then you just are like, well, I guess, you know, do I just go with like Phuc or, you know, and so in Vietnamese, my name is pronounced Phuc, you know, which doesn't look like it's written, you know, because of the wonky sort of orthography. And also my parents, you know, there are so many nicknames used in my family for everybody in the family. And so for a long time, I just didn't even know what my name was. And then I was like, and at a very young age, I just thought, well, what's my name in English? Like, cause like, you know, English speakers aren't going to be able to say Phuc. And so my dad just kind of like pulled a name out of it. He like just literally was like, I guess it's Phuc, you know, like sort of based on the PH of English. And then the UC, you know, like I'm really thankful that he didn't sort of like just go with like the super profane sounding version of it, which he certainly could have done. Yeah. And then, and so that was my name. You know, what's odd is, or not odd, is that, you know, my brother was born, you know, right when 9 months maybe after we arrived in the US. And my parents like sort of had the foresight to be like, okay, we're just going to give him an English name. And they named him Louis, or Louis, which was sort of like a little bit of a nod to the French associations or the French colonization of Vietnam. Anywho, so yeah, so in 5th grade, so I like went through all of elementary school as Phuc. And then in 5th grade, I just was like, oh man. 5th grade was when I discovered that my name sounded like a curse word. I'm not going to swear. I'm not going to soil the Newburyport Lit Festival with my potty mouth. Anyway, you can imagine what a profanity that sounds like Phuc. So in 5th grade, I was like, oh no. Like, you know, it's like you're already dreading middle school, and like you've got acne happening, and like your clothes don't fit you, and like, you know, all sorts of other bodily things happening. And then now you're like, oh man, my name sounds like a profanity. And so I changed my name to Peter for a day, because I thought, oh, like Peter Parker, like Spider-Man, this is going to be like super cool. And then immediately the kids were like, oh, Peter, you mean like the word for penis? And I was like, oh no, you know. And so I was Peter for one day until the kids told, started saying things like "suck my Peter," and then I changed my name back to Phuc, and I was like, wow, this is.
Well, you got to try it for a day. It worked. It didn't work out, so pop back in. So
yeah.
It's funny because when I found out that I was going to be talking to you about this, and I had read your book, and I went on to Google, and I have listened to Google say your name 1,000 times.
Oh, I've never heard it.
I can't. It's the last sound. I don't know what it is, and it's a computer generated voice as is, but there's that last tone of your name that I was struggling. So I asked you. I was like, help me out, and so I just thought that was really interesting. It's sort of a microcosm of the idea of assimilating to American culture, and sort of the fact that you have to even change the overall pronunciation of your name and who you are. I thought, and it's sort of a theme that you talk about through the book. And I thought that was just a really powerful story, the day you were Peter, and not realizing that there was that next thing, because it happens to us. So there's so much in this book to unpack. I have so much I would like to talk to you about. Some of it's darker and some of it's really, really funny. But I thought what we could definitely talk about is the bullying and sort of the stuff that happened when you started school. There's part of your book where you talk about, and you say, I believe that I was bullied because I was Vietnamese. So I did the math for my survival. Be less Asian, be less bullied. Armed with this simplistic deduction, I tried to erase my otherness, my Asianness, with an assimilation, an Americanization. That was as relentless as it was thorough. It just broke my heart, this little paragraph, because you were a child when you made this decision. How have you reflected upon that? Has it, and with your own children, and raising them in the current world? I have conversations with my friends, very little changes, as much changes in the world, and what's going on in the world right now with the Asian American community. This bullying theme just sort of really stuck out, and at times sort of broke my heart, and at times I saw your strength through it. So I thought maybe you could talk about living through that a little bit too.
Sure. I mean, yeah, and I think it's certainly like that idea of assimilation, I think is gone. It's sort of like the flip side of sort of America's racial politics in the 70s and the 80s of being colorblind, right? Like, so it really is like part of the same currency, right? Is we'll pretend that we don't see race, and then you could just be like everyone else, and that is assimilation, right? That like somehow, if you sign sort of like the social contract for America, we'll treat you just like an American. And it's certainly, it was something that my parents believed, like they absolutely believed it. And I think, and for them, like that's the magic of America, and they really believe it. And in some ways, like they're holding America to a higher standard by believing in that contract, right? This idea that like, in no other country, like Russell, you could move to Vietnam, speak perfect Vietnamese, and you would never be considered Vietnamese. Sorry to break that to you. I know I'm crushing dreams here left and right. But the fact that my parents even believed that we could come, I mean, I think they showed up here, right? And they're looking around at this, sort of, polyglot, multi-ethnic, country that is America, and there's like a guy named Sanchez, and there's a black guy, and like, people from India and wherever, and they're all like Americans. And my parents were like, holy smokes, like we can do it, And so in the 70s, they were like, okay, like this is our job. Like our job is to make sure that our kids assimilate and become American as much as possible. And so we were getting it from, my brother and I were getting it sort of, from at home and at school, where that was definitely, there wasn't this idea of like celebrate culture or like tell me about where you're from and all that's like in like a celebratory way, right? It was just sort of like, no, like let's just pretend that you're like everybody else. And and obviously, like I think we've advanced as a culture, right? And like we recognize that like assimilation isn't necessarily like the healthiest and the best way, for marginalized communities or minority communities. So yeah, it was, and I think now, You know, I mean, I think I'm a different, you know, I'm not my parents, and I think like culturally we're just in a very different place. So I think, you know, for my daughters, like I think are, you know, if they're interested in, you know, sort of their, you know, Vietnamese heritage, I think it's great, and I want to celebrate that with them. But you know, but I also recognize like their journey is their own journey, so I don't want to impose, you know, sort of, you know, my you know, luggage and sort of crap on them. But yeah.
Well, and you know, that transitions nicely into the thing, into your escape from all of this, which was books, really. And your memoir, each section sort of focuses on a different classic and sort of weaves that into your own story. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was your discussion of the library, and how important that was to your development, but also your father was a big library fan. There's a section where you say, my father loved the library because it was a safe haven for him. No missed cultural cues, no bigoted insults from his coworkers. And I thought, as a fan of the library, and I know probably a lot of the people who are listening to us right now are library staunch fans, you know, I thought maybe you could talk about the library, what you found at the library, the books, because books become sort of a cornerstone of who you wind up being as you move through life. So could you talk about the library and books for me?
Yeah, absolutely. My, you know, it was sort of like this thing that my dad always talked about when we were growing up. You know, he said like the very first thing that he did, you know, when he got to America was he went and got like a card to the public library, and he had the exact same card for like the, you know, 20 years that we lived in Carlisle. And you know, and side note, like my brother and I lost our library cards all the time, and it drove him insane, like insane. Like it was like, oh my God, what is wrong with you? You know, like yeah, anyway. So, I mean, it was like where he went to like read books, and like, I mean, like, you know, he had to repair all sorts of things in our house. So like anytime he, you know, this is like pre-Google, right? So like the library was like his Google. Like if he needed to know anything, like he went to the library and like looked it up. And so, you know, I don't know if that was normal or not, but it was definitely what my dad did. And so like I just grew up being like, oh, if I don't know anything, like I guess I should go to the library and look stuff up. And so like he would always drag us along to the library, like while he would like read manuals about like how to repair like a, you know, washing machine. And then my brother and I would just like hang out and like read books, you know, about whatever, like monsters and pirates and ghosts or whatever. And I, you know, I mean, it was so baked into me that like, you know, when I discovered, you know, this thing called punk rock, like, which I didn't know anything about, I was like, well, how do I learn more about punk rock? Right? Like it's like it's like the most like backwards thing. I was like, I guess I should go read about punk rock in the library, right? And so that's what I did. Like I went and got a book about like rock and roll history, and like I read like the 2 pages or 3 pages about punk rock. I remember specifically photocopying the pages, like spending 30 cents to photocopy those pages because I would just rack up like late fees. And I was like, well, I could check this book out and pay like $7 in late fees, or just like 30 cents to photocopy the pages.
Well, we were going to talk about that. I think that, you know, in your TED Talk, in the book, you know, you celebrate your nerdiness. And I thought that there was nothing more nerdy to me than wanting to be punk. So we went to the library. I think that is just like one of the best things I've ever read. And then there was like only 2 pages, but you were going to take those pages with you. And that was how you were going to define your punkness, which I thought was great.
Thanks.
Talk about punk a little bit and what it did for you in high school, and maybe suggest to some of our people who are watching a band that you just felt really encompassed that time period for you.
Oh gosh, yeah. So I mean, I think, you know, I discovered punk, you know, through the library, through reading. So, you know, I discovered sort of like early like British punk, right? So like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I mean, I think like between those two, I think like the Clash, I mean, I think if like, you know, Newburyport Literary Festival attendees, if you've never listened to any punk rock ever, it's okay. No judgments from me or Russell. You can go onto Spotify and like listen to the Clash, you know, like just there's like a little button that says like, this is the Clash. And then you can just click on that. I think they're very accessible still. And there's so many sort of permutations of punk rock. But I think for me, you know, at the heart of it, like I think punk rock is about this sort of like challenging like power, right, and speaking truth to power, and reclaiming agency in your life. And I mean, just every aspect of it really spoke to me, especially as like a Vietnamese refugee in a small, white town in the 70s and the 80s. Like just hearing anybody sing about like, oh, my parents don't get me, and oh, like my school is really, the teachers are like jerks, and I get bullied, and it was just like, oh my gosh, like where has this been, and it was, I mean, I think like that through line, or that connection, to things that I had been reading prior to that, like the Scarlet Letter. I mean, like for me, like the DNA between things like the Scarlet Letter, and like the Sex Pistols and the Clash is like so strong. Like, and really, like it's just about like reclaiming like who you are from who people think you are, or who people say you should be, right? I mean, I think like all the best sort of the books that speak to teenagers, right, and the music that speaks to teenagers, like has that as baked into its DNA. So
Yeah. Well, so, talking about sort of the power of the songs and the words and the lyrics, you talk a lot about language and words. And there was one part where you say, do what we want. Do we want words to be powerful or powerless? We can't have it both ways. And I thought that was, and that whole paragraph, by the way, I could read the whole thing to you, but I'm not going to. It's on page 55 if you're looking for it. I just thought it was so brilliant. Because you are a person, it's not in the book, but after this, you go on to be a classicist. You teach Latin. You taught Sanskrit for a while, correct? Which
yes.
I didn't even know was a thing.
Yeah, me neither.
You learned German. You had a minor in German. Vietnamese, English. The power of words across these languages. How does that sort of inform you as a person now? Because you're an artist, as a tattoo artist, you're an artist with ink and drawing, and then you're also an artist with words. So how does all that sort of come together for you?
Gosh, I appreciate that. I think I just feel like I think in both of those endeavors, like I think there's a lot of precision, and the precision of it is important to me. Like I think you can appreciate this as a tattoo collector, Russell, and as a reader, right? Like you want the tattoo to look the way it's supposed to look, right? And and so like I just think it's really important, like every line, every, the way it's shaded, the way it's colored, like I want to give it a lot of thought. And I think that's true for the written word as well. And I think as much as possible in, the spoken word, obviously, and that's not to say that in conversation, like we can't be messy and like, misspeak and, backtrack and maybe contradict ourselves. But I think for me, like the process of writing, I think I really want to mull over everything and make sure that it says exactly what I want it to say with efficiency, right? Like I really want to have it also feel stripped down. So I think there's like a little bit of that like punk rock, like boil things down to their bare essentials. But also I love words. So like I really love like weird words, or like obscure words, or like words that are just like, what does that even mean? Like I just love that. To me, like unused and like sort of like archaic words is sort of like the literary equivalent of like the distortion pedal on a guitar. You're just like, it's like, you're like, ooh, like what does that even mean? So it's so I hopefully, and thanks for appreciating it, like I hopefully like my love of language and like just words and like celebrating how kooky English is comes through in the book.
It does. It's great. Well, in talking about books, we actually have a question from Linda. She asks, the bookshelf behind you seems to be much older books. Do you read modern literature? If so, what and who do you read?
I do. I do read modern literature, and really only because of my book club. I get walked off the plank every month, and it's like, okay, I guess I gotta read Kazuo Ishiguro now. Like, so I'm reading that right now, and I'm really enjoying Clara and the Sun.
Oh, love that book.
Yeah. But what have I read? I think one of my favorite books that I read recently was Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here, which I like adored that book. That was incredible. And this year we read, what else have I read that I've loved? The Overstory by Richard Powers was amazing. So I do read modern books, but you know, I really love rereading. I don't know about you, Russ. I know, like, I think maybe it's like a bookstagrammer. Like I think you're constantly having to read new
I
books,
do. I don't
right?
reread as much as I probably should.
Yeah, so I love rereading things. And then because I have my hand in, like, you know, sort of other languages, like I'll do what's called maintenance reading, you know, so like I'll just like pick up some Latin or some Greek or whatever and just like read just to keep my, you know, sort of keep that machinery oiled as well as it can be.
Yeah, like all of us, just picking up a little Latin, a little bit of Greek, you know, I'll just do it over breakfast.
Oh,
I get
God, does that sound pretentious? Can we delete this?
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I know in your TED Talk, you talked about how you thought you were going to be like a literature major and you found classics, and that was where you really sort of fell into love with that and how that became sort of your passion, and then also tattooing. So yeah. I want to get all the questions. And so Ryan asks, have you always wanted to be a writer?
No, I didn't. I thought like, I think because I just love reading so much, and it just felt daunting to me. Like you know, like, just to be honest, like I just love consuming or appreciating the product so much. Like I was like, when am I ever going to have time to write a book? And also, who the hell am I to write a book anyway? There's so many books that I want to read. Like, I'm going to die having read much, you know, fewer books that I wanted to read, right? Much like you, I think, Russell. Like my tombstone's going to have like a giant TBR pile. But I never thought, at least as a young person, I never thought like someday I'm going to write the great American novel. And I definitely met kids like that in college. So you know, that said, like, I think I've just been like an appreciator of writing and words and language for so long that when the opportunity came along, I just thought, well, I'll give it a shot. Like I know what I like, so I feel like at least for one book I can write the book that I would have wanted to have read. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer that question, Russell? I don't know.
I think it does. I think it does. I think well, I want to thank Linda and Ryan for their questions, because I forgot to say that. So thank you both very much. But Kate sort of asks the next question, Phuc. Are you writing something else? Is it novel or is it nonfiction?
Yeah, so I have 2 contributions in anthologies that are out. So I was invited to contribute some nonfiction essays to those. Those are out. I don't think I should say more about that. And then I'm sorry, this is like really weird. Like and then there are some other things that I'm working on that I probably can't say a whole lot about. And so I'm working on some stuff for another sort of media form that is not the printed page.
We'll leave that vaguely out there, you know, and it allows people to come for it.
Yeah, so it's chewing up a lot of time. So I mean, obviously, like, I'm still tattooing, and then and then I'm doing some other work for other media that's chewing up some time. You know, I think that's it. I definitely am excited to write more, but it's a sort of like, you know, until I discover the 36-hour day. Let me know if you find it in San Jose, Russell. I could totally use an extra.
I mean, interesting you talk about tattooing, because, you know, this book sort of stops at the end of high school, but tattooing is clearly a big part of who you are now. And I know when we talked before this, you know, you graduated college and you were offered an internship in New York City as a tattooist. How did that happen? And how did you become a tattoo artist? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like being in the punk rock scene in high school, like I always was very interested in tattooing, and I drew like my friends' tattoos, and, you know, that was like a piece of the memoir that, even like, I think just because of the length and the thematic elements we had to cut out, was like how my deep love of like the visual arts and drawing and all that. Like that was a very strong through line through high school. And then And then in college, so I never had money to get tattooed. So I just never got tattooed in high school. And you know, tattooing it's a luxury item and it's expensive. And then in college, I discovered my parents had given me this emergency credit card. It was sort of like if you break your leg or if you need bail money. And I discovered that it had this thing called the cash advance function. And I was like, what's this? Free money? So I totally like took money out with the cash advance function. And started getting tattooed in college, and then got tattooed more in graduate school. And then I was just getting tattooed so much that, you know, I mean, as you know, it's like you get tattooed by the same person over and over again, like you end up developing a friendship with them. And then in grad school, I was, you know, the guy who was tattooing me in New York, you know, said, you know, hey, like, you're really heavily tattooed, and you know, you seem like you're really into the lifestyle, and you know, we're looking for an apprentice. You should apply. It'd be great. And I was like, oh, like it just like never even dawned on me that like it could be a viable career option. So yeah.
And now you own your own tattoo studio in Portland, correct?
I do, yeah. So I was tattooing in New York City up until 2003, and then my wife and I left New York. Just, you know, we were sort of doing the math on like, you know, how raising a family and, you know, owning a home and, you know, opening a business, and it just felt, you know, the barriers are so high in New York City. I mean, just, you know, cost wise, and so Portland seemed much more doable. Yeah.
And when we say Portland, we mean Portland, Maine.
Portland, Maine, yeah. So my wife, yes, Portland, Maine. Yep, yeah. My wife is from Maine, so you know, she showed me so like the unofficial slogan for, you know, Maine is like, you know, the way life should be. So she showed me the brochure, and I was like, well, hell, the way life should be. Let's go. You know, if Maine is good enough for E.B. White, it's good enough for me.
We have a couple more questions that have come in. Jesse asks, as a 70-year-old former Carlisle resident myself,
wow,
would you consider us both ultimately scarred, or I'm not sure, benefited from the experience? I think that's supposed to be benefited. I apologize, Jesse, if I read your question wrong. From the experience
of living in Carlisle. Wow, that's it's tough. I think. I mean, I visited Carlisle in 2017 on a research trip while I was working on the book, and like met up with friends and my high school teachers and stuff like that. I think, I don't know if it's like an either or. I think it's both. You know, it's complicated. I mean, I think America is a complicated place for some people who live here. I would say for me, for sure. You know, I don't think that I could live this life anywhere else, the life that I'm living anywhere else in the world, you know, and for that I'm deeply grateful, you know, and, you know, and, you know, America has lots of blind spots and places that it can improve. And just, you know, the thing that it advertises itself as, I think it's still striving to be. And so I think it's for people like you, Russell, and like me, and anybody else who feels like it's not living up to, you know, as advertised, you know, if we're not getting the thing as the marketing says it is, I think it's important for us to say that. And everyone does better when everyone does better, right? Yeah. So I think going back to the Carlisle question, you know, I think it's both. I think there were things about Carlisle that were amazing. Like, you know, in retrospect, like I recognize it was sort of like the classic American childhood. But as a, an Asian kid, and, you know, in a predominantly white town in the 70s and 80s, it was also a classic American childhood.
Yeah. Anne asks, do you have any favorites among the Greek mythological stories, and do you read them to your children?
I do. So many. I think, I love the myth of, Daedalus and Icarus. I think, I think that the tricky thing about a lot of this is okay, I'm going to put on my nerd hat, like the super nerd hat on now. I think a lot of Greek myths are designed to maintain social hierarchy, and that is to say social power. And so the Greek word for everything in its place, right? Like mise en place, like is the Greek word cosmos. And so that's where you actually get the word cosmetics or cosmetology. It's like when you do cosmetology on your face, like everything is where it's supposed to be, right? Like everything looks, exactly as it should be. An opposite of that is chaos, right? So in Greek, the opposite of cosmos is chaos. And that's when like everything's topsy-turvy, power is threatened, and and that could be as simple as like the man is in charge of the household and kings are in charge of the cities, and and masters are in charge of their slaves and things like that. And so Greek mythology in general, like there are some exceptions, but in general, like they're all cautionary tales about what happens when you upend the cosmos. That is to say, when you upend the power structure. So I mean, like all that stuff is tricky, because like I think I want my daughters to have like a healthy sense of, like questioning authority, and like, even me, like as their parent. So they read these stories, and they're ancient, right? Like many thousands of years old, and they're all designed to sort of keep everyone in their place. And so I think they're reading them very skeptically and with a lot of curiosity. But anyway, that was really super nerdy, and I'm going to stop now.
I don't think it was as nerdy as you think, but you're probably talking to a whole entire webinar.
Okay, yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Right.
Thank you for that questioning. And Kathy, thank you, Kathy, asks, who is your current favorite punk rock group?
Gosh, so true confession, I really don't listen to a lot of punk now, and that's not any judgment on people who still do. Like I think I think like punk was really powerful for me in a specific time and a specific place. I would like to say that like I've sort of grown more mature, and like I think my taste in music is broader and just more nuanced. Like I think I had, as a teenager, like you're so dogmatic about everything, right? Like everything's black and white, there's no nuance. And like I got to college, and like I met all these kids who were like listening to things that I just thought like wasn't cool. And then one day I just thought, like get the chip off your shoulder, like just listen to, if it's good, it's good. Like why, like, instead of being like, well, if it's not punk rock, it's just trash. And, I mean, imagine like being like a 20-year-old, like I was, and like hearing Motown for the first time, like Marvin Gaye, like my mind was blown. I was like, what's this? This is amazing. You're like, oh, this is, what's going on? I was like, he's talking about like, environmental degradation and like war. And like, it was, anyway, so I listen to all sorts of things now, right? But, something that I really love right now is this sort of like, kind of like modern, like hip hop electronica artist who records under the name Blood Orange. So anyway, shout out. Yeah, if you love Blood Orange, he's a performing artist named Devonte Hines. He's amazing. But yeah, so I'm a big fan of Blood Orange. Not punk rock though. Yeah.
An anonymous viewer asks, have you returned or gone back to Vietnam?
I haven't. It's on my list. I tried to go back with my parents for a long time, and because I just feel like that trip would be so rich, and as sort of like dysfunctional as my relationship is with my parents, I can still acknowledge that I want to go to Vietnam with them, and they're like the lone holdouts in my family. They really refuse to go back. They have just such deep personal animus towards the country and the outcome of the war. And so, after like many years of my trying to convince them to go with me, I just sort of like, all right, fine, I'll just go by myself, or go with my wife. And then our girls were born. And so now we're waiting for my daughters to be old enough so that we can just all go as a family. But like my brother's gone, my aunts and uncles have gone, like my uncle bought like a beach house there. So yeah.
Well, I think I've gotten all the questions. Phuc, this has been absolutely amazing. I could literally talk to you for another hour. I have so much that I could go
thanks.
I think we could listen for another hour. I saw in the comments people were saying like, keep going. We want this to go forever. It's really fun to listen to you guys talk. So I've totally enjoyed this whole session, and I think the others have too. Thanks. So, but of course, every time my face comes back on the screen, everybody's like, oh, it's over.
No, they're like, oh, okay, thanks so much.
Yeah,
Well, thanks so much, Jen.
I'm the killjoy that shows up and says, we got to wrap up. Oh, now somebody snuck in a
He
question.
just wants to know if we'll be able to view it later, which I'm sure you're about to answer.
Well, that's a good question, and I can actually answer that. So yes, I am recording this. So we've been recording all the sessions. We do need to edit them a little, like the beginnings and stuff. So we need a little time, but then they will be available on our website. So yes, you can come back and watch it over and over again, studying this interview.
Don't do that. I don't recommend that.
No,
but I do say bye, Saigon. Bye.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah, from your local bookseller, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you to our attendees. You've been a great audience. We've had great questions. We still have 2 more sessions today on my track. I mean, there's, I guess, 6 total because there's 3 tracks going on. So there's still more festival. So I hope we'll see you in another event. Phuc, thank you so much for joining us. And Russell, you were a fantastic interviewer. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jen.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Russell. Bye.
Bye, Phuc.
Bye.